So they're either considered monosynaptic or polysynaptic. We'll talk about both. Okay, so what I want you to know about reflex arcs are there are 5 steps. So I want you to know the 5 steps, and I want you to be able to describe to me what's happening step by step by step, okay, which we pretty much already talked about. So step 1 in a reflex is you have to have a receptor, okay, that's sensitive to some sort of stimulus, okay? This example, the stimulus looks like a nail being driven into the skin, so what kind of receptor would you say that is? A pain receptor, what do we call those? Nociceptors, right? So that could be an example that you can provide for a reflex arc. So step 1 is the receptor then receiving the information, okay, that it's sensitive to, in this case it's pain. That information then gets sent along a sensory neuron, okay, which structurally is what? Unipolar, right? Unipolar. So you got the cell body, you got a single process. Peripheral process goes into the periphery where it picks up the sensory information, and then you've got a central process that brings it and delivers it into the posterior gray horn of the spinal cord. Okay, so in the posterior horn then, it's going to synapse with an interneuron. Okay, so that takes us from step 2 then to step 3, which is integration, analysis. Okay, so the interneuron is going to think about it and decide what to do, and the interneuron then is going to synapse with a motor neuron, and the motor neuron is going to take information out, away from the CNS, towards some sort of an effector. And the effector here looks like it's skeletal muscle. So we can say that that motor neuron is a somatic motor neuron, right? Because it's terminating on skeletal muscle, and the overall effect is contraction. Okay, so those are the basic steps of a reflex. Now, like I said before, reflexes can be either monosynaptic, just have one synapse, or more than one synapse. So this is an example of a polysynaptic reflex, including all the steps. So for a monosynaptic reflex, okay, the best example of a monosynaptic is a stretch reflex. So if I wanted to check, for example, your L2 spinal level, and I wanted to tap on your patellar tendon, the information that's received in the spinal cord would be the sensation of stretch. So when I hit the reflex hammer on your patellar tendon, it's going to stretch that tendon, and it's going to pull on those muscle fibers and those sarcomeres, and the sense of stretch is going to be stimulated. So that information, again, is going to go through a spinal nerve, which we know houses both sensory and motor information. This is around the L2 level. Structurally unipolar, so cell bodies are going to be found in the what structure? A dorsal root ganglion, right? We don't have a ventral root ganglion, only a dorsal. So that information comes in then through the posterior horn, but it doesn't synapse until it meets that motor nerve in the anterior horn. The cell bodies and dendrites of the motor neuron in the anterior horn, okay? So essentially the integration is the sensory neuron communicating with the motor neuron. And the communication is basically stretch, okay? So the motor neuron then gets stimulated, sends information out the ventral root into a spinal nerve, terminating on an effector, which is the quadriceps muscle. And the overall desired effect is contraction. And so you extend your leg, okay? And when you do a reflex, it's lightning fast, right? It's just boom, you tap the tendon and you instantly extend the leg or the knee, okay? So again, because it's only one synapse, this is gonna be super, super fast. And this type of pathway doesn't have to go up or down, okay? It's unconscious, involuntary, unlearned. The information comes into that spinal level and it comes out that same spinal level, okay? So the only communication you're having is the sensory neuron communicating with the motor neuron. And so that's why it's lightning fast. So I could check L2 for a patellar tendon. If I wanted to check S1, I could tap on your Achilles tendon, and then you would get plantar flexion. Your gastrocnemius would contract. I could check your C5, your biceps tendon. If I were to put a reflex hammer on your biceps tendon, boom, stretch, you're gonna flex the elbow. Or I could check C8. C8 is triceps. If I hit your triceps tendon, you're gonna extend the elbow as a reflex response. Okay, so super duper fast. Super fast, super fast. Okay, so the second example of a reflex is polysynaptic. So polysynaptic is called a withdrawal reflex. Okay, so that's the best example of a polysynaptic reflex in the body. Again, unlearned, premeditated, nothing you can control. So the stimulus in this example is, okay, you're about to touch a thumbtack with, the tip of your finger. But you could be, it could be maybe your hand on a hot stove element or something. Or, we've all done this when you're washing your hands and you think the water's warm and you put it under the water, but the water's scalding hot. And before you know it, you've already reflexively taken your hands away from that water because it was too hot. So the stimulus, again, this looks like a nociceptor type receptor. It's going to send the information in through a spinal nerve. Okay, it's going to synapse, but the sensory neuron is going to synapse with the interneuron because we're polysynaptic now, so we're adding an interneuron to the story. So that sensory neuron then is going to synapse with the dendrites and cell body of that interneuron in the posterior horn, right? Because posterior horn houses sensory information. That interneuron then is going to think about it. Okay, what type of stimulus am I receiving? Okay, well, it's painful stimulus. So then the axon terminals of that interneuron will then terminate in the anterior horn, okay, of gray matter of the spinal cord, because this is where we find cell bodies and dendrites of somatic motor neurons, right? So that motor neuron then gets stimulated, sends information out the ventral root, out the spinal nerve, and terminates on, the example here would be like your biceps muscle. And the overall effect is contraction of the biceps muscle in order for you to remove your hand from that painful stimulus. And again, this happens lightning fast, right? But it's not as fast as a monosynaptic, right? Because you're adding another neuron in the chain. So it takes, maybe a nanosecond longer for a polysynaptic reflex to occur, okay? But it's still involuntary, something you don't have any control over. All right, questions about reflexes? Yes.
So if it's pain, does that determine that it's polysynaptic, or is it just the type of reaction that happens?
Yeah, so pain is probably the best example of a polysynaptic reflex, because if it's a withdrawal reflex, more likely than not you're withdrawing from something irritating or something potentially painful. Yeah. Okay, so let's draw. So again, I think drawing a reflex arc is nice because it summarizes a lot of the concepts that we've already talked about, and it tells me whether or not you know sensory versus motor, unipolar versus multipolar versus bipolar, you know, what type of information is in a root, what type of information is in a nerve, what type of information goes in posterior horn, what type anterior horn or lateral horn, whatever the case may be, okay? All right, so first off, let's label this picture so that we're just all on the same page here. Okay, so just gonna circle this. Okay, so name that structure that I just circled. What is that?
Spinal nerve.
It's a spinal nerve, right? It's a nerve, right? Okay. So a nerve then splits into, I'll just use numbers, number 1 and number 2. So what's number 1? Dorsal root, yeah, and number 2 is? Ventral root, okay. What's number 3? Dorsal root ganglion, right? And we defined a ganglion as a collection of cell bodies in the CNS, right? Okay. Okay. So then let's go into 4, 5, and 6. Okay, so what's 4? Posterior horn. 5, lateral horn, and 6, ventral or anterior horn, right? And what type of matter is this, gray or white? Gray. Okay, and we also talked about what kind of structures we find in gray matter, which are what? What do we find in gray matter? Interneurons, dendrites, cell bodies, axon terminals, synapses, right? So we determined that the overall function of gray matter is analysis, integration. Good. Good. And then in, well, yeah, before I go there. All right, what's 7? Posterior column or funiculus. Okay, 8. Lateral column or funiculus, and 9. Anterior or ventral column or funiculus. And is this gray matter or white matter? White matter. And what do we find in white matter? Myelin, which is what makes it white. And myelin wraps itself around what? Axons, right? Good. And collections of axons in the CNS we call collections of axons in the CNS we call tracts, right? Collections of axons in the PNS we call
Ganglion.
nerves. Right? Okay. What's this little hole here in the middle called? Central canal, and on either side we have the gray commissure. Okay, good. That allows for communication. Okay, so we also talked about lateral to the spinal nerve. We have a dorsal and a ventral what? Not root. Ramus, right? Rami is plural, okay? And we said that the dorsal ramus goes dorsal in the body and serves what? Where in the body does it serve? The back musculature, right? So the erector spinae. That's the only time we're talking about a dorsal ramus, is when we're talking about the erector spinae muscles, okay, and the nerves that go to them. Everything else travels through a ventral ramus. Everything else. Okay, so So I'm gonna start with a monosynaptic reflex first, okay? And I'm just gonna do Achilles tendon and my little reflex hammer right there, okay? So I'm gonna hit the Achilles tendon with my reflex hammer. And that's going to stimulate the sensation of stretch along the axon terminals of what kind of neuron? Sensory or motor? Sensory, okay? So, what I'm drawing then is I'm starting the peripheral process of my sensory neuron, okay? And that's gonna go through the ventral ramus, okay? Not the dorsal ramus, we're not talking about erector spinae, okay? It's going through the ventral ramus, okay? And that peripheral process continues and it enters what structure? The spinal nerve. And then it enters what structure? The dorsal root. And then we stop and we draw a cell body coming off of a process in the enlargement that we called the what? The dorsal root ganglion, right? Mhm. So structurally, we're drawing a unipolar sensory neuron. Okay? So now I'm gonna continue with the central process, and that's gonna continue and enter the spinal cord into the posterior horn. Mhm. But it's gonna continue, because we're drawing monosynaptic, and it's gonna terminate where?
Lateral one. Anterior horn.
Anterior horn, right? Okay. Because we're talking about a somatic motor pathway, right? So the axon terminals then are gonna be in the anterior horn. I'm gonna start my little multipolar motor neuron, which axon exits out of the spinal cord through what structure?
Ventral root.
Through the ventral root. And then from the ventral root it enters a what?
Spinal nerve.
Spinal nerve. Then it goes into the ventral ramus, right? Then it comes out and it terminates on, again, we're not artists here, it's just muscle fibers. Gastrocnemius muscle. And the overall desired effect is gonna be contraction. In response to the stretch stimulus, right? So, number one is the stimulus, the receptor. 2 is the sensory neuron taking information in. 3 is the integration or the communication between the sensory and the motor neuron. 4 is the motor neuron sending information away from the CNS towards the effector. And then 5 is what happens at the effector, which in our example is gastrocnemius muscle contraction. Okay. So, do you think you're gonna see something like this on Wednesday? Yeah, it's a great exercise for you to show me that you know multiple concepts. Okay, so that's monosynaptic. And you can pick anywhere, you know, you can pick whatever you want, biceps, quadriceps, you know, triceps, whatever floats your boat. Okay, so now let's draw a polysynaptic. Okay, so for polysynaptic, colors are relevant here, so I'm just picking colors. Let's see here. So to draw, you can just describe to me. Okay, I'm just gonna do hand under hot water. Okay, so that's gonna be my stimulus. And this is gonna be a painful stimulus because it's gonna be very hot. So that's what I'm choosing to do. You can choose for polysynaptic withdrawal, you can choose, you know, the bottom of your foot. Maybe you're stepping on a piece of glass, you know, in the sand at the beach or something. Alright. Okay. So, starting with that then, I'm going to switch colors and I'm gonna have my sensory receptors terminals, okay, picking up that sensation of excessive heat. It's gonna go into the ventral ramus, okay, so I'm drawing my peripheral process of my sensory neuron. It's gonna go through the ventral ramus, and it's gonna enter what? Spinal nerve, and then it's gonna go where? Into the dorsal root, and I'm gonna draw a cell body coming off of one single extension because we're talking unipolar, and it continues. Now this is polysynaptic, so where is this sensory neuron going to terminate? Where are the axon terminals going to be found? What part of the spinal cord? Posterior horn, right? Because that's where we're going to find cell bodies and dendrites of the next structure in the chain, which is an interneuron. And interneurons are structurally what now? Multipolar. So those axon terminals then of that interneuron are going to terminate where in the spinal cord? What horn? Anterior horn. Because I'm picking a somatic, I'm picking a somatic motor pathway, okay? Withdrawal. Okay, so then the cell body of my motor neuron and dendrites are also going to be found in the anterior horn. And the axon then is going to extend into the ventral root. It's going to enter a what? Spinal nerve, and it's going to continue out the ventral ramus. Yep. And it's going to terminate on, again, let's say the biceps. Brachia. And the overall result is contraction. And this is going to be contraction away from the painful stimulus, okay? Because the receptor is sensing pain, not stretch. So it's contraction away from the painful stimulus. Okay, so I could, you know, again, I could like draw a little foot and say piece of glass in the sand to do same pathway, and this, maybe this motor neuron then is gonna contract, or going to terminate on my gastrocnemius muscle in order to lift my foot up off of that painful stimulus. Or maybe I want it to contract on the psoas major, the hip flexor, to lift my entire leg, get it up away from the stimulus. So you can create your own story in terms of what you want the stimulus and the effector to be, okay? But it's important to know structurally what the sensory neuron looks like, where that you find the cell bodies, where you find the axons, okay? Where the axons terminate, in what part of the spinal cord, whether or not you're gonna find an interneuron if we're talking polysynaptic, if not monosynaptic. If it's poly, interneuron cell body is going to be in the posterior horn. It's going to terminate in the anterior horn, where you're going to find a multipolar neuron, okay, cell body and dendrites. And then that will exit and terminate on the effector, all utilizing the ventral ramus, okay? And we know spinal nerves carry both sensory and motor information, all 31 pairs. Okay. So on the exam, I'm not gonna have you draw a cross-section of the spinal cord, okay? I'll give you this picture, and I'll have you draw on it. So don't think you have to draw a cross-section of the spinal cord, you don't. I'll provide you the foundation, and then you just draw a pathway for me and describe it. Describe the five steps to me. All right, questions about mono, poly, drawing? Okay. Okay, so let's review. And again, I'll post this on Canvas so that you guys can use this for your studies. Okay, so we have two functional classes of neurons. What are the two functional classes of neurons that we've learned?
Somatic and motor.
Sensory and motor, right? Sensory and motor. So if we're talking sensory, then what's the structural type of neuron? Structural. Unipolar, right? Or bipolar. Bipolar, again, is found in special senses. We're really focusing on unipolar, but yeah, you can say unipolar and bipolar. Okay, so then if the functional class of neuron is motor, then what's the structural type? Multipolar. All right. So what structures make up the brainstem?
Midbrain, pons, and
Midbrain,
medulla
pons, medulla oblongata, right? Okay. What's the function of the medulla oblongata, or what's one of the functions?
Rate, respiration, and cardiac.
Respiration rate, heart rate, kind of big, biggie. What about the pons? We mentioned there's a little bit of respiration that it's responsible for, but we also mentioned the bladder, so bladder input. What's the difference between a sulcus and a gyrus? Sulcus is a depression and a gyrus is a bump, right? And that's just the way brain matter is organized, so you can get more in a smaller cavity, right? So there's lots of brain tissue, but that's why it's organized that way. Okay, what is the outer gray matter of the cerebrum called?
Cerebral cortex.
The cerebral cortex, what's the function? It's basically your conscious mind, right? It gives you consciousness of what's going on. Okay. So name the glial cells of the CNS. So first let's name the glial cells of the PNS, because there were only two and they both started with an S.
Schwann and satellite.
So there are Schwann cells and satellite cells. And Schwann cells are responsible for what? Making myelin, right, for nerves in the PNS. And then what were satellite cells good for?
Structural.
So structural support, protection of the cell bodies of those neurons, okay? All right, so now the CNS, we had four, I believe. What's one?
Astrocytes.
Okay, I heard, okay, astrocytes, we'll start with that. And astrocytes are responsible for what?
Glutamate uptake.
So taking up neurotransmitter.
Blood-brain barrier.
Okay. And then I heard oligodendrocyte, that's responsible for what?
Myelin sheath.
Making myelin, okay, in the CNS, okay. What other cells do we have?
Microglia.
Microglia, and those are responsible for just cleaning up and, yeah, invading any kind of pathogens. And then that leaves us with,
Ependymals.
oh yeah, ependymal cells, and those are responsible for
Lines cavities.
for circulating cerebrospinal
Cerebrospinal
fluid,
fluids.
right? Doesn't make cerebrospinal fluid, but it circulates it. What makes cerebrospinal fluid? Two words, starts with a C.
Choroid plexus.
Choroid plexus. Okay. All right, how do spinal nerves connect to the spinal column? Name the two structures and what kind of nerve fibers they carry. Okay, so what's one structure? Dorsal root carries what kind of nerve fibers? Sensory. And then what's the other structure? Ventral root, and that carries what kind of fibers? Motor. Mhm. Okay, we don't have to do all this, but again, make sure that you can name all 12 cranial nerves and know their function and whether they're sensory, motor, or both, right? Some say Mary Money, but my brother says Beer Fruit. Okay, what is the function of the basal nuclei? Well, how do we define nuclei in the CNS? It's a collection of
Cell bodies.
cell bodies in the CNS, right? So, where are they located? They're located in clusters of gray matter in the CNS, right? So what's the function of these basal or gray nuclei then?
Analysis.
Yeah, so it's, again, communication, integration, analysis, just another part in the brain where that can occur. Okay, so that's why they're called nuclei. And they all have different names depending on what's synapsing in them, and we're just not knowing that. We're just generalizing and calling them brain or basal nuclei. Clusters of cell bodies in the CNS. Okay, which of the following structures is in a somatic part of the body? Is the bladder?
No.
No. Is the lung? No. Stomach? No, those are all in body cavities, right? Ventral body cavities. So the answer is B, biceps muscle. Okay. Which of the following structures is not part of the CNS? So I'm hearing B and I'm hearing D. So, is the brain part of the CNS?
Yes.
Yes. Is the spinal cord?
Yes.
Yes. Is a tract?
Yes.
Yes. Is a nerve?
No.
No, right? Nerves are in the PNS. Okay, name the ventricles of the brain and give the region of the brain in which they are located. So, okay, you're starting first with the right and left lateral ventricles, and those are found in the right and left cerebral hemispheres. Yeah. And then those connect through the interventricular foramen. And then the next ventricle in line is the third ventricle, and you find that around what structure? Starts with a T. The thalamus, right? So the third ventricle lives around where the thalamus is. Okay, then we jump into the cerebral aqueduct and terminate at the fourth ventricle, which is where we find, it's kind of in between the cerebellum and the pons, kind of right there. Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, I'm not going to have you draw a cross-section of the spinal cord. Don't worry about that. Where are sensory cell bodies located? In the DRG, right? In the DRG. Where are motor cell bodies located?
Gray matter.
In gray matter, right? So we can take this question one step further and say, where are somatic motor cell bodies found? Where in the gray matter? In the which horn? In the anterior horn, right? Somatic motor neurons. Okay, then where are visceral motor cell bodies found? In the lateral horn. But all sensory cell bodies are located in the DRG, right? The dorsal root ganglion. Okay. Where are interneurons located? In gray matter of the CNS. Okay. What cranial nerve is the major sensory nerve of the face? Trigeminal. Not facial. So how do we define a nerve plexus? Mhm. So we identified 4. Okay, the most superior plexus is which one? Cervical, and that feeds head and neck. Really, yeah. The next one in line is what? Brachial, and then that feeds arms. And then the next one is lumbar, and that feeds more,
Thigh.
yeah, lower extremities, specifically anterior surface, or front side. And then the 4th plexus is the sacral plexus, and then that feeds back side of the legs, right, including glutes and saddle. Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right, so which cranial nerves have parasympathetic or visceral motor fibers? So we listed 4. Okay, cranial nerve 3, which is what? Oculomotor. Okay. 7, which is what? Facial. 9, which is vestibulocochlear. And 10,
Biggest.
vagus. Okay, so 3, 7, 9, and 10. Okay. So, if the functional region is the visual cortex, what lobe are we talking about? Occipital. Mhm. And if we're talking about the frontal lobe, what functional region is that? So how would we describe the cortex in the frontal lobe? We said it was the primary motor cortex. Right. So it's primarily the motor cortex. It's all frontal, right? Somatosensory cortex is what lobe? Parietal lobe, right? And then auditory cortex is temporal. And then if I were to add taste, sense of taste, is insula. Mhm. Yeah. Should say portion, not potion. Which portion of the spinal cord, gray matter or white matter, provides the two-way conduction pathway for signals between the body and the brain? White matter, right? It's going to allow for transport. Okay. And then this one is just, I'm not going to ask you this on the exam, but this is just something to get you thinking about. So if the ventral horn of the spinal cord in the lower cervical segments is damaged, so say like C6, 7, 8, somewhere like that, you have ventral horn damage. What's a ventral horn responsible for? Motor neurons. How would that patient present? Paralyzed, right? Probably paralyzed. Unable to move on their own. Okay. Okay, where are pyramidal cell bodies located? So how did we define clusters of gray matter in the CNS? What did we call that? Yeah, basal nuclei or brain nuclei, right? That's where we're gonna find pyramidal cell bodies, okay, in clusters of gray matter in the CNS, okay? So then where are the tracts located? What's the definition of a tract? It's gonna be a collection of axons in the CNS. So we're gonna find axons where?
Matter.
In the white matter, right? So we're gonna find tracts in white matter. And where did we say that these tracts cross over? Where in the brain?
Thalamus.
So decussate means crossing over. In the medulla, right? Because the medulla has pyramids. And in the pyramids is where the pyramidal cells cross over. Okay. Okay. general touch to conscious awareness. So let's put these bullets in order then, going from the general sense of touch to you being consciously aware of what it is you're touching. So what would be the first item? So it would be a sensory receptor, pick that up, and then what's next? Go to a sensory nerve, right? And then what? Communicates with an interneuron, and then what? It goes up an ascending tract, which is sensory, okay? And then from the ascending tract, it's going to synapse in the primary relay station, the thalamus, right? And then ultimately, the thalamus is going to tell it to terminate where? Primary somatosensory cortex. And at that point, then you have conscious awareness of what it is you're touching.